back to the International JavaScript and PHP Conference 2020. My name is Sarah Schlotthauer. I am the editor for jackcenter.com. The following session is about Retrofit Test Suite in existing React apps, and it will be brought to you by Mirjam Bäuerlein. Before I give it over to Mirjam, just a quick bit of information. You can use the chat and swap card to get help via our technical staff if there are any problems, but you can also just use it for chatting and commenting on the session. You can ask questions via the integrated QA tool or via the chat box, and if there is time after the session, then Mirjam will answer your questions. And with that, I am pleased to announce Mirjam. Take it away.
Thank you. So I will start sharing my slides. Okay, so welcome. As Sarah said, I'm Mirjam, and I'm honestly always having a hard time figuring out what to say about myself if I introduce on conferences. So let's start with some facts. I'm a software developer and work on the front end. I am currently working at a remote company called Brighter, where we build a non-code editor to enable others to build decision automation, which is pretty cool. And now 2 completely random facts about me. I once built, as an exercise, a really simple chatbot. And now LinkedIn recruiters think I would make an awesome senior chatbot consultant. And potato chips will always be my comfort food. They are way better than chocolate for me. Okay, for real, there is one thing you need to know about me, at least for today. And that is, when I got into touch with automated software testing, I fell in love at the first test. When I started my job at the company Brighter, it took about, I think, a week until a coworker started making jokes about how he would write more tests since I'm here, because he would be afraid I would judge him for writing not enough. And honestly, I think he was only half joking. People have said about me, I would get way too excited talking about testing, but I don't think that's even possible. And today I want to share some of that excitement and love for testing with you. In this talk, I will give you a broad view on a topic that is in itself big. So I created a roadmap we will follow through this talk, so you can have an outline which topics I'm going to talk about. So this talk is based on a project I worked on at my former employer, and I can't tell you too much about it, NDA and stuff, but it's basically a big B2B shop for e-audiobooks and ebooks. The first commit on the front end was done in September 2015. So when I started at the company, the project was already 3 years old. So not really that old, but I think front end years are a bit like dog years, so it was kind of old in that way. On the 23rd March 2018, and I will tell you later why this date is important, we had almost 39,000 lines of code, almost 300 JavaScript files, and around 240 React components. We had an end-to-end test suite based on Selenium written in PyTest. The tests ran 2 times a day at that time. And we had around 900 tests, and that's an okay number. Looking at integration and unit tests, this looked a bit different though. And different in that case means null, nada, nil. We didn't have any. Okay, how did that happen? It happened what happens with a lot of software, I think. It kind of grew historically. So the work in front end has changed so much over the past few years. The first website I built is so different from what I'm doing in front end now. It's really wild. So there's a lot of logic that moved into the front end, and the complexity grew immensely. What means the need to have tests there, of course, grew too. But the naturalness with which we actually do write tests in front end didn't grow as fast, at least in my opinion. So we will often be encountered with a problem my team and I face at this point. Legacy front end code running in production that needs to be extended and to be maintained. Some of you may think, okay, Mirjam, legacy code, is this really the right word to choose here? Is it not a bit over the top? And when I started in development, I thought, okay, legacy code, that is code that is really old and it's bad. And it's, of course, written by someone else. It's kind of the code where you open your editor and you just say, okay, nobody touches nothing. But Michael Feathers wrote in a book, "Legacy code is every code without tests. So no matter how old it is, no matter who wrote it." And I really like the definition because it shows how important tests are. The state of the code in our project was, it worked in production. People could use it, the client generated money out of it and everything. But adding new features got more difficult. While adding new features, we caused more and more unpredictable bugs. And honestly, our confidence in changing the code shrinked. So what to do if you identify that kind of red flags? That's an easy answer for me. You write tests. And okay, I gotta be honest, when I say this, it's probably not the best argument ever, because writing tests is the answer for a lot of things to me. Sometimes I even write tests when I'm stressed. But there are objectively good reasons for that, and they apply to new code the same way, so we will just take a quick look here. So for one, we want, of course, our code to be future-proof. We want it to be extensible. We want to have an easy refactoring. We want to reduce bugs long-term, and we want to find bugs before the user does. With new projects, these arguments often make totally sense for everybody, but existing projects can be a different beast, especially if you haven't written most by yourself. In that case, let's be honest, we developers often think we are going to rewrite it anyway at some point. On on-site conferences, normally I make a little survey here, and I ask the people to hold up their hands if they had have the thought when they looked at older code or code they didn't write. And normally there are a lot of hands in the air. I mean, I think this about my own code all the time. But if we are being honest, it almost never happens. And especially in professional software project, it would not even make sense to do so, because there is existing code, which solves a problem for the user. And somebody put in work and thoughts and time to build that code. To take that and throw it away and nothing else is rewriting is wasting this resource. And often it's not possible anyway, because the user or the client depends on it. So the goal has to be adding new behavior like features to our code, and on the same hand, make sure that the old behavior and of course the new one is still working like expected. So now you have a picture from where we started on, and you know that I thought the best solution would be to add unit and integration tests to our application. From one person on the team thinks we should add tests to really doing so, it is still a long way to go. And the first step is I had to sell this to the people that are working on the project with me. And first I had to sell this to my team. So everyone on this team was a software developer. So of course they already knew which benefits tests are offering. Basically, all I did was reminding them over and over again about things they already knew. And I made starting as easy as possible. So I added a test runner, I set up everything, I included the first tests, so they could just work with tests and start to add tests without any hassle. And now you can see why the 23rd March was so relevant, because it was the day I added the setup and the first test to our project. And as you can see with my second commit message, I was really excited about everything. After this, it was easy. I added tests, I encouraged others to do so, and that's important, I praised them for doing so to motivate them. The next to convince about this is the lead or the leaders in the project. That was, in our case, really easy, because we worked in cross-functional teams which decided about technology in the team. So our organization structure simply had no person above. We had to ask about permission with tech stuff. In companies where this is different, I would suggest if it's a technical lead, you can apply the same argument as with a team. A good developer simply knows about the benefits of tests anyway. If it's a lead more on the business side of things, I would suggest arguing the same way as you do with a client or other stakeholders. They have, of course, a big interest in the economic side. So what does this cost in time and therefore in money? My opinion here is I'm a software developer, so I am responsible for the quality of the software I deliver. And a test suite is, like an editor or an IDE, a tool with which I can reach and maintain that goal. I don't ask my client or my business lead which IDE I should use. So in the same way, I don't ask if I'm allowed to add tests, period. Of course, it is important to act in a way that is responsible in an economic sense too, because we cannot pause all work on a project, take 3 months and add tests. The goal has to be continue working productive on the existing project, so building new features while adding these tests. And we will take a deeper look here later. So here I want to recommend a few tools that can help achieving quality right from the beginning. You just have to add them. What we did first was we added a code formatter and linting for our project. We didn't have that before. And just this alone reduced our discussion time about code reviews, I think around 80%, which was really good. Next thing is we extracted all small components we used over and over again in the component library. So that made it easy to test them in separation, but it also made it easy to see, okay, there is already a button that looks like the one I want to apply. So we didn't implement double components. And two colleagues of mine did some magic. I have no idea how they did it. And our tests, our end-to-end tests that ran 2 hours before, now could run in 20 minutes, which meant we could run the test suite way more often than before. So we could run it before releasing a big feature and so on. And last but not least, we added an error tracking in the application with Sentry.io, which we didn't have before. And it was really interesting how much we learned about our project and how many bugs we found. So the whole ordeal, so implementing tests, started in spring, and it started kind of with a trial period. I started adding tests. Then others started to add a test here and a test there. During that time, we talked about testing as a possible approach in our retrospectives. And when finally in the summer, the decision was made to add tests as a fixed part of our workflow, we defined rules how to do so, and we added them to our definition of done and wrote them down in our team contract. And these rules were, you had to test before every commitment. You could only commit if the tests are all green. You also have to test before every build, so the tests run in our pipeline too. And tests from that point on were part of the code review. That means if you do a code review, you have to take a look into the tests and see, are there enough tests? Do the tests make sense? Do they test the important stuff? And are there not too much tests? And last but not least, we started, if we saw in the code something where we thought, okay, this could be improved, this could be refactored, but we didn't have the time, we created tickets out of that. Preferably really small tickets. So we created a backlog for our technical debt. Okay, let's see how far we are on our roadmap. We have the setup, everybody is on board, and we defined rules. It's official, we start adding these tests. Now, let's talk about when should you actually add tests or write tests. And it's important to think about this and to make a plan, because we want to be responsible in an economic sense and don't cause unnecessary costs to our client. And of course, we want to make good use of our time too. And the first thing to know here is, it is okay to leave untested code that works and that is not touched untested for now. It does not feel good for someone like me, but it's really okay and it makes sense. It works. So, but from now on, we had the rule that every new functionality, components, helper functions, and so on, had to have tests. And this rule is the easiest one to follow because I start from the scratch here, and adding tests at the beginning while writing code is normally way easier than to do so after. The next thing is, if there is a bug, the first thing I do is I write a test for that bug that catches it. This test should fail, obviously, because the bug is there. And after that, I fix the bug. So the test turns green. And now I know this bug, the specific bug, will not happen unnoticed ever again. And before I change existing code, either because I want to refactor it or have to extend it, I should write tests that make sure that existing functionality will work as expected. And last but not least, since we had now our technical debt backlog with all the small tasks, it was easy to use idle time. For example, if I finished something a few hours before the weekend and I didn't want to start something new, I could take a look into the backend, grab a small ticket and work on that. In my current company, some teams have a defined day for this kind of things. So the Fixing Friday, for example. Okay, you saw now how we decided over the question when to test. And now let's take a look about how to test. I will drink. Okay. This is a point that is mostly relevant for existing code because testing new code is easier. So let's say I have a component that takes care to show a list of products and I should change something here, change a few. How do I approach this? Before I touch anything in the code, I first write tests for the existing code. Yep. Even if on first glance, I can see that there's stuff to refactor, I start with tests. The only expectation would be there's a bug. And that sounds like more work. And yes, sometimes it can be, but it is worth it. These kinds of tests lock down the behavior of existing code. They are characterization or pinning tests. They often will be integration tests because I don't want to test single units of code, but I want to test the bigger picture. I want to make sure my component shows the product list like expected. One method to do so is, for example, I call a function in my test with specific arguments and I expect it to return null. The failing test will tell me what the function actually returns. So I can take this value and add it to my assertion. The same goes for components. I add the right properties and I look which DOM elements are rendered. And now I can test for the most important ones. On a side note, snapshot tests can make sense here, but not necessarily, because as soon as I start changing stuff, they will fail. So we didn't use snapshot tests for this kind of tests. What we are doing with this kind of approach is, I like to imagine that I build a little fence around my code. So this fence makes sure that nothing can break out and fail. And existing behavior will still work as expected, even if I start changing some things in the code. So these kinds of tests are not meant to run for all eternity. They are not good tests. They test only what works under ideal circumstances. A good test also tests edge cases, and I can be sure a good test fails when something weird goes wrong. But these kind of tests help me to get a quick feedback loop if I start refactoring now, because I get a feedback, everything is working still. The goal for a balanced test suite, and I mean, you all heard about the testing pyramid, should always be to have a broad base with a lot of unit tests. Integration tests and even more end-to-end tests are slower and they tend to be more brittle, which is something we learned in our project with 900 end-to-end tests really the hard way. But small local tests, on the other hand, make sure that a small part of my code is working almost perfectly. And if this kind of test fails, it tells me and it shows me where the problem is pretty clear, so fixing is easy. And because of that, I should take the time now to refactor my code and my tests and start adding new functionality later. And of course, it always depends on the time I have. So to add a new functionality, at least I start with a test for it. And now I try to work in a test-driven way. So I write a test that fails, I add as much code as is needed to make this test pass, and I refactor and write the next test for the next part of the code. And yeah, that's not always possible, I know, but I try to follow this as often as I can. So my team and I had a lot of learnings during that time, and a lot of hard learnings too. I want to share the three, in my opinion, that are the most important ones. So for one, if I have to add a functionality to my code, so new code, but I don't have the time to build my little test fans about existing code first, and let's be honest, that will happen. I should try to separate the new code, except for a few interfaces, from the old code and test the new code really good. And the best case is I also add tests in my old code to make sure that the interface is working so that everything is connected all right. This is not the ideal approach because I don't add tests for existing code, but it is way better to add more untested code in my project. A good way to separate code is to take as many logic as possible out of my components. Write logic in helper functions or classes in pure JavaScript and test these functions. And of course, you can also use TypeScript if you have to. Writing tests for pure JavaScript or TypeScript is way more fun and more effective and easier than writing component tests because I don't have to render a component, I don't have to mock store, I don't have to use fake outs like shallow mounting or shallow rendering and so on. So the separating is an approach I follow with a new project too. So I don't add logic in components that is not needed for state or prop handling. A lot of helper functions enables a lot of unit tests, and I love unit tests. The next thing is in React, we used to talk about dump components or better stateless components that changed a bit with hooks. But this kind of components are more stable and easier to test than a stateful component because, yeah, they are dump. So if I have to add a few to my existing untested component, like my product list, and I don't have the time to test this existing component before, it can help to create new small components that handle this view. And now I can test this component in my existing, now I can test this component on its own. And in my existing component, I just make sure that the component is rendered in the right way and the right properties are passed to it. And please note, this is still a solution that is not good, but it is not as bad as it could be. The goal should always be also to add tests to my old code. The next learning we had, and this is my strong opinion here, is with untested code, I think it is more important to get it testable than to encapsulate it in the right way. So for example, if I have a component that is wrapped in a higher order component, I prefer to export it separately to be able to test it in separation in an easy way. And it is also okay for me to expose a method that actually should be private and test it. The same goes for helper functions that are used internally in a module. I want to add, this is not a good pattern for new code, exposing and therefore kind of creating code just to test it. But in this case, with existing untested code, it is more important to reach a better testability and to add more tests. I can always refactor later. And last but not least, probably the biggest learning or the most important one is you will not reach a perfect test suite here. You will not reach a really high test coverage easily. But that is not a reason not to start adding tests because 10% coverage is better than null. And of course, it's not as good as 70%, but it is a start and you have to start somewhere. So don't let like the thought, oh my God, I can't read perfection, be an excuse for not starting with. we are at the summary already. So most of the time I talk with other devs about this endeavor. One question comes up. Did it actually work? Did it make sense in hindsight? And I will be honest, in the beginning of this whole process, we oftentimes had the feeling of fighting against windmills or trying to put out a forest fire with a watering cane. So what does this one tested component help me if there are 237 untested components left? And maybe you can see that one ball in this pen has like a check mark as in tested, but all the other ones have not. And this one check mark looks really a bit lost. So we started cautiously. We went into the code, we looked around, we were not sure where to start, which tests could be useful, and we felt lost. But the more tests, especially unit tests we had, the more confident we grew with this area of the code. So we could often switch from a fear-driven approach to these tests to a more curiosity-driven. So let's poke in here and see what happens and add a test instead of trying to poke into code and fearfully waiting what will go wrong. It started not to feel as random anymore. The refactoring got easier and adding new feature and functionality felt safer and faster, especially because new stuff was the best tested stuff. And then at some point, people in my team reached, some of them more often than others, something I would like to call the Mirjam state of testing. It starts to be fun. So the confidence to change and to add and also to remove things in tested code areas grew. And now I don't have to be afraid to destroy something important anymore. So I can build new stuff, I can make old code better, and I don't have to reload my browser every step in that way to make sure nothing really important broke here. And honestly, the first time I refactored a component that was tested really thoroughly, it felt like cutting through butter with a hot knife. So to wrap this all up, we started with this testing. So I started adding the test suite and the test runner and the first tests in spring. And from summer in this year, we started to add the test as a fixed part of our workflow. At the end of the same year, the team got split up and started working on 2 new projects for the same client. And the project this talk is based on was retired in maintained mode for at least for that time. And in this roughly 6 months, where we added the test seriously, we went from a unit and integration test coverage of 0% to 30%, which is not the world, but it already helped a lot. And we did it in half a year. In the new project, the now 2 teams started, everybody added tests from the beginning because we learned a lot with this other test stuff. And everyone noticed how much more stable the code got and how much easier it was to add or to remove or to refactor code. And these 2 projects started with a way better base and are more stable than the old one. And just for that, it was totally worth putting in the effort we did with the old project. And that actually at the end of my talk. And I think we will go now to Q&A. But I just wanted to show you my last gift. I didn't have a slide where it fit, but I love it because sometimes programmers, and me including, can be a bit dramatic about if they are asked to write more tests. Okay, I will stop sharing now and we can switch to Q&A.
Thank you so much for a great talk.
Thank you.
Usually this is when the audience would be giving you applause. So maybe the folks at home can write their applause and thank yous in the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
I just saw myself. Oh my God, that's
There's
really
a
odd.
few seconds of delay, so people may be typing.
So I had to pause the video. I was completely confused just now.
Someone asks, what do you use besides Jest to test? Did you use testing library, for instance?
So in the project we started with, we used, I forgot the name, oh my God. The big thing before from Airbnb, Enzyme, oh my God. With a new project where we started to use hooks, we used the testing library. And in the project I'm working on now, it's Vue-based. We are also using the testing library. But in the old project, Enzyme was the way to go. Yep.
Any more questions?
I was too fast, right? I spoke too fast.
Oh, no.
It's okay.
Of course, if anyone thinks of any last second questions, could they send you a message on social media, on Twitter? Oh, okay, we have another question. What's the coverage level you were able to reach so far in that legacy project?
Yeah. So we had around 6 months doing this because the project got retired in maintain mode after that. And we went from null to 30%. So it's not much, but it's honest work. It helped already.
Any other questions?
Thanks. We felt it was a good job too. So I'm currently working at an 80% coverage in my current project. That's really good. Makes so much fun writing code with that coverage.
Okay, great. It doesn't look like any other questions are coming in, but like I said, if anyone thinks of anything last second or it's keeping them up at night, they can send you a message on, is Twitter your preferred social media?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for, oh no.
And then, so questions about testing are always welcome.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for an excellent talk, and thank you everyone
Thank you.
for attending, and have a great rest of the day and have a great conference.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.